Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the second webinar in our series on California's BEAD sub-grantee selection process. Today, we'll focus on project areas, negotiations, and the extremely high cost per location threshold. I'm Ali Eshraghi, Program Project Supervisor for the BEAD program at California Public Utilities Commission. Before we dive in, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter today, Joanna Hovis from CTC Technology and Energy, who will guide us through today's presentation. Here is what we'll be covering today. First, a quick introduction and housekeeping items at the beginning. Then we have a brief recap of BEAD's high-level goals for those joining us for the first time. After that, we go through what constitutes a project area under the BEAD program. And following to that, we'll discuss alternative pricing for 90% coverage. After that, technology prioritization, which describes what is NTI's mandated prioritization order of different technologies. And finally, in today's presentation, we'll discuss project negotiation and selection process. And at the end, we wrap up with what's ahead. Next slide. Thank you. A few housekeeping items before we begin. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A or email them to beadgrant@cpuc.ca.gov. We will not be able to answer questions during the webinar, but we will be building our Q&A document to answer questions during the webinar, after the webinar. Keep an eye on the chat because we will use it to send useful links to you. English closed captions are available. Select Show Captions on your toolbar or click the small arrow on the Show Captions button for more settings or to see a full transcript. Select side-by-side speaker mode for the best viewing experience when the slides are shared. Now I'll turn over the presentation to Joanne from CTC.
Thanks very much, Ali. And it's a real pleasure to be here for this webinar and to share this information with all of you. I'm going to start, as Ali said, with some background and an overview of the BEAD program for those of you who haven't already seen this information. Let me start by noting for all of you that there is a document that is the most useful resource when it comes to understanding not only the BEAD program nationally in terms of the federal rules that govern it, but also the way in which the CPUC will administer the program. That document is called the Initial Proposal, Volume 2, and it's a document that the CPUC developed over the course of 2023, put out for public comment in late 2023, and then revised both in response to public comment and in response to feedback from the federal government. That document, once it was approved by the federal government in the fall, became the governing document for the BEAD program in California. Every single state and territory had to prepare an Initial Proposal, Volume 2, as well as a bunch of other documents. But most consequentially, that one, the Initial Proposal, Volume 2. And for each state and territory, that approved document is now the governing document for how states have to administer their programs. You will hear me refer to it dozens of times during this webinar. I will probably use the shorthand for it, which is IPv2 or Initial Proposal Volume 2. It is available on the BEAD page of the CPUC's website as approved by the federal government. And I can't overstate how significant I think it is that anyone who is thinking about engaging in the BEAD program in California, submitting an application or trying to understand what the process will look like, should really read that document. I have a printout. It's on my bedside table. It is my most important source of reading at all times, and I refer to it daily. If you're thinking of filing an application, you should do the same because it will be the best guide you have to the framework and the rules that the CPUC has proposed to the federal government and that the federal government has accepted for this program. Now, the program itself is, as I think most of you know, a program that was funded under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and is being overseen and administered by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or NTIA, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Under this program, California received one of the larger allocations of funds, which is $1.86 billion. And the allocation was based on a number of different factors. And California's allocation was robust, although not in any way excessive. And quite frankly, as is the case in most of the West, not at a level that is likely to deliver best-in-class infrastructure in 100% of the state, but that is part of the challenge of the BEAD program. Determinations of what the allocation for each state was were based on the statute and then were then made by NTIA, and there was no input or participation by the states. And the program has a multi-phase element to it, in that the last few years since the IIJA, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, was passed and then signed by the president in 2021, these last couple of years have all been the planning effort in anticipation of what the CPUC is launching now, which in the language of the BEAD statute is called subgrantee selection. So under BEAD, the $1.86 billion is awarded by NTIA to the CPUC as the designated entity for California. And then the CPUC is responsible to subgrant through a subgrantee selection process, most of those dollars to entities through the process that is described in the initial proposal, Volume 2. That effort is launching now as we speak with these technical assistance efforts. So planning over the last couple of years, culminating in an approved initial proposal, Volume 2, and now going forward into the actual grant program administration, that is to say, subgrantee selection. That is the phase we find ourselves in now. As I think many of you know, the BEAD funding at the direction of Congress is prioritized first for areas that are defined as unserved within the framework of the BEAD rules established in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Second priority, underserved. Those are also based on a definition in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And then finally, if there are funds left over, community anchor institutions, who are defined differently, and the goals for service defined differently as well, but with a top prioritization of unserved and then underserved areas, which are described in detail in the initial proposal, Volume 2, and the CPUC's commitment to try to secure a broadband solution for all unserved locations and underserved locations throughout California. In order to do that, the CPUC designed a subgrantee selection framework and set of structures that would allow it to execute on this enormous charge that Congress directed the states to undertake under NTIA's supervision in return for the BEAD funds. And I want to start by just noting that there is something very consequential about the BEAD program that has never existed in any other broadband grant or other funding program, whether federal or state or otherwise. And what that is that requirement to do all, to try to get to 100% of unserved locations and possibly underserved as well. And that element that is in the BEAD statute and elaborated on in great detail in the rules that were established by NTIA as the oversight entity for the BEAD program, that requirement to get to 100% determines a lot of how states have to administer this program and the way they designed their programs, because unlike other grant programs, states are not in a position to simply review every application that comes in, score them, and then make awards to the highest scoring applications. Rather, the state has to, within that finite budget of $1.86 billion, develop a solution that it can afford on a statewide basis for all eligible locations. There are many elements of the way BEAD subgrantee selection was designed by the CPUC that are responsive to that need. And it is part of the reason why the BEAD program will look different and will be managed differently and will require different kinds of information and commitments from subgrantees than any other broadband grant program that the CPUC has administered in the past. I bring that up because it will help you to understand what I'm about to discuss here, which is project area design, but it'll also help to illuminate why I keep going back to the initial proposal volume 2 and why that document is so important. It is because it describes something that is very different than any grant program any of us has been involved with in the past, because BEAD is simply different to any other grant program. In order to get to that 100% goal, NTIA required the states and territories to define project areas as a means of trying to ensure that applicants would not just apply for the locations that they found to be most economically attractive or economically viable, but would also make commitments to serve locations that might be somewhat less economically attractive because they might realize a lower return on investment. Every state has done this in its own way in its initial proposal, volume 2. And the structure that was determined by the CPUC and then commented on through public comment last year very extensively is that the project areas will be defined by census block groups throughout the state of California that have eligible locations in them. So for any census block group, and I should add also tribal areas, because tribal areas are treated as their own project area units and not subdivided by census block group. But for any census block group or tribal area that has eligible locations, those will be eligible for applications. And that would be the minimum, a designated minimum geographic unit for a grant application. But applicants will be able to combine contiguous project area units, census block groups, or tribal lands into a single application so long as they are contiguous. But may not subdivide, may not pick and choose which locations within that project area unit they want to bid on. Applicants will be required to provide a proposal and application for 100% of the eligible locations, the unserved and underserved locations in that project area unit, that census block group or tribal area. And what you see here are citations to where this is discussed in the initial proposal, volume 2, as well as in the decision that was adopted by the CPUC, enacting much of that content. And I, again, recommend that you refer to the initial proposal, volume 2, as well as to the CPUC's decision to see the language in its original form and as it will govern this program. But starting point for understanding BEAD and its uniqueness relative to other programs is this concept of project area design. Summarizing again, applicants may bid on, in a single application, a project area that is as small as a single census block group or tribal area, or can combine multiples into a single application so long as they are contiguous. But is required to bid on 100%, provide pricing and a proposal for 100% of the BEAD eligible locations in that project area unit. Now let's talk about an additional alternative option that is available to applicants to also provide alternative, not substitute, but additional alternative pricing at 90% rather than 100% coverage by project area unit. What the CPUC has determined here in the decision and in the initial proposal volume 2, and you see the citations throughout, is that while applicants will be required to provide that pricing for 100% of unserved and underserved locations in their designated project area, that combination of census block groups or tribal lands, they may also, in addition to the 100% pricing, offer pricing for service to 90% of all unserved and underserved locations, as well as providing a list, and the application will make this possible, a list of which locations they would not include, so the 10% that they would not include under the 90% structure. And the reason that this was created as an additional element of the program is to provide flexibility for applicants to offer economically viable applications in the case where there may be just a few locations that make a given census block group or other project area unit so costly that it would not be feasible within the CPUC's finite BEAD budget of $1.86 billion. It would not be feasible to fund that project area unit. So the alternative additional pricing at 90% will enable the CPUC, if it does not have sufficient funding statewide to fund at 100%, to rather than not having a solution at all for that project area unit, be able to consider proposals at 90% as well. And I'll show you in some detail what that decision-making process looks like in just a few minutes. So project area units are census block groups, minimum size, or tribal areas can be combined into a single application if they are contiguous. Pricing must be offered at 100%, but may also be offered at 90% coverage. Now let's talk a little bit about the technology prioritization that NTIA has established. And like many elements of the BEAD program, this is a set of federal rules that California, like every other state, is working within as a mandatory requirement. And what I'm showing you here in the citation that you see here is the guidance that was distributed by NTIA in January of this year. Very helpful and important guidance for understanding how the federal government is requiring states to consider applications based on technology prioritization and definitions that I'll show you in just a moment, and how this then flows into the subgrantee selection grant process design that the CPUC has proposed and was accepted and approved by NTIA, and that the commission then approved in the decision. The next few slides are all copies of data provided by NTIA. So what I'm showing you here is not content that was created by the CPUC. It is rather NTIA. That's very important in understanding how NTIA has established the rules. A few things I want to point out in this context is NTIA has defined what reliable broadband service means. And then within the context of reliable broadband service, which is basically various kinds of terrestrial wired and wireless technology that is capable of not less than 100 megabits per second in the downstream direction, not less than 20 megabits per second in the upstream direction, and latency that is less than or equal to 100 milliseconds. Within that, NTIA has established as the priority projects those that are end-to-end fiber optic facilities. You can see that in definition number 2. Other reliable broadband services that, in addition to fiber optic, but not priority, would be cable modem or hybrid fiber coax technology, digital subscriber line technology, and terrestrial fixed wireless that uses entirely licensed spectrum or hybrid licensed and unlicensed. And then, as an alternative technology for that does not qualify as reliable broadband service, NTIA has established that alternative technologies are unlicensed fixed wireless and low Earth orbit satellite that still need to meet technical requirements. In this case, no less than 100 megabits per second, downstream, no less than 20 megabits per second, upstream, and 95% of latency measurements falling below 100 milliseconds. So those are the definitions. What does this mean from a technology prioritization standpoint? You can see it here in NTIA's graphic. NTIA anticipates that at the top of the prioritization stack, and in NTIA's view, likely to be the most extensive form of funding will be fiber optics, priority technology in their language, end-to-end fiber. Coming next in the stack will be other reliable broadband services that qualify, including hybrid fiber coaxial, DSL, and licensed fixed wireless, and hybrid licensed unlicensed fixed wireless. And finally, at the bottom of the prioritization stack, unlicensed fixed wireless and low Earth orbit satellite. And what that means in practice, I'm going to skip through this slide because it's lots of detail, but you will all have access to this because I think this graphic makes the point that NTIA has much more clearly. What this means in practice is something along these lines, and let me walk you through this, this flow chart of selection criteria and decision making as NTIA, this is their document, has established it. And this is a very simple way of understanding it. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you a little bit more detail of what it's really going to take to enact this. But it begins with, if you can see my cursor, hopefully, up on the left toward the top, the bids, the applications are submitted to the state, and the state has to consider, are there for any given project area priority applications? Priority, as you will recall, is end-to-end fiber applications. If there are priority applications, then the state has to determine for that grant area, is the cost within what they call the extremely high cost per location threshold. And I'm going to come back to talking about that in a moment in some detail, but think of the extremely high cost per location threshold for now as it is effectively the budget that is available for a given grant area, given the fact that, as you'll recall, the state has to secure a solution for 100% of eligible locations in all of the grant areas. And as a result, there is not an infinite number of dollars available for any given grant area. There may not be sufficient dollars available for any grant area. But if there are priority end-to-end fiber bids, and if the cost is within that budget, that extremely high cost per location threshold that establishes how much money is available for that grant area, then that end-to-end fiber application must be funded. If there's not, then the state can move on. Or if there's no priority, no end-to-end fiber application, or if it is not within the affordable threshold, the budget for that grant area, then the state can move on and consider, is there a proposal for other kinds of reliable broadband. As you'll recall, those were hybrid fiber coax, DSL, and licensed fixed wireless or hybrid licensed unlicensed fixed wireless. If there is an application of that sort, and if it is within the budget, then that has to be funded. If, however, there is not an application for a given grant area of reliable broadband, or that is not within the budget, then the state has the option at that point, as a final resort, as the lowest priority, to select unlicensed fixed wireless or low Earth orbit satellite. So you see here how NTIA is thinking about, or requiring, I should say, the state to consider and prioritize proposals, beginning always with, is there an option for an end-to-end fiber solution for a given area? If there is it affordable? If so, it's funded. If there's not an option or it's simply not affordable, then we can move on to the second priority for technologies, other forms of reliable broadband. Does that exist and is it affordable? If the answer to either of those is no, then the state may then consider unlicensed fixed wireless or low Earth orbit satellite. And that is the decision-making framework that effectively enacts this prioritization of technologies as determined by the federal government and required by the federal government of all of the states and territories if they accept BEAD funds. Now, let's talk for another minute about the extremely high cost per location threshold, or the EHCPLT, which is a lengthy name and a very, frankly, complex construct that was created by NTIA as a tool for ensuring that states align with NTIA's prioritization for technologies. And this is discussed in some detail in the initial proposal, volume 2, if you are looking for a narrative discussion of it. And I expect there will be questions about this because I encounter them very frequently. But what the extremely high cost per location threshold is the dollar figure at which the state is permitted by NTIA to fund a technology other than end-to-end fiber, other than priority technology. So it is the mechanism that NTIA created for ensuring that states prioritize those fiber applications. When the CPUC, like every other state, submits at the end of this whole process a document called the final proposal to NTIA. And that will be the document that is created at the end of this entire grant-making process that reflects the outcome of the grant-making process. And NTIA will have to approve that document in order for the CPUC to begin giving funds to its provisional awardees. When it submits that document, the CPUC will have to tell NTIA the dollar figure at which it simply became too costly in various parts of the state to fund fiber, that given the overall need for funds throughout the state to every grant area that has eligible locations, it was just too expensive to fund fiber at certain dollar figures in different parts of the state. So again, you'll recall I called that, it's the affordability element, or the budget by grant area. The extremely high cost per location threshold is the number that the CPUC will write into that final proposal in order to demonstrate that above that cost, it did not have affordable fiber proposals and is therefore justified in funding other technologies. Because the fiber proposals were simply too costly. This is, again, why I encourage you, rather than sort of getting wrapped around this jargony phrase to think of this as the budget, the available dollars for a given grant area, given the need to reserve dollars for every other grant area to ensure that the funds are distributed across the state to develop an affordable solution for all eligible locations statewide based on that 100% requirement that is part of the BEAD program. Okay, so this is the simplified view of what BEAD looks like as NTIA has graphed it. Let me now show you what we think it will look like, or what is included in the initial proposal volume 2, which again is your best resource. The initial proposal volume 2 and the CPUC's decision for understanding exactly the process that the CPUC will undertake in making these decisions. And you will all have access to this deck, which includes language from the documents and citations to the relevant pages, and describes in brief what the process looks like. What I am going to do is just briefly go through these slides and then show you graphics that we think take this very complex process and hopefully make it that much more understandable to see how the CPUC plans to undertake this effort, particularly since you've already seen NTIA's mandatory required graphical framework for what this will look like. It will start with the receipt of applications, scoring of applications, and then calculation based on the dollar figures in the applications, as well as other data the CPUC has of how much budget is available for each of those project area units in light of the need to distribute budget across the state to get to 100% of locations. And that set of numbers will be developed on a very preliminary basis to allow the CPUC to understand how much funding it may have available and what it may need to negotiate to bring costs down in various areas relative to the costs included in the actual applications. And then working through all of the applications in order first of technology. They'll be ranked by technology, right, with fiber, end-to-end fiber first, based on NTIA requirements, and then they will be ranked by score. The CPUC will look at all of the applications and based on those budgets, determine whether the highest ranking application for a given project area unit is affordable. And can be funded or preliminarily assigned to be funded to that application. And if time is available, the CPUC may be able to negotiate where possible to bring down the pricing with the highest scoring applicant if time is available, because the CPUC will be working within a statutory timeline that requires it to finish this process within 365 days of when the initial proposal volume 2 was approved by NTIA. But wherever possible, there will be an effort to do that. And in the event that there are not immediate solutions, solutions of those fiber applications that are the highest ranked based on technology and then score, the CPUC may, if it has time and believes it will benefit the process, consider those alternative percentage at 90% numbers, as well as other types of negotiation, or even soliciting additional proposals. Now, let me show you what this means. I promised that there was a graphic that would make this simpler, and this is the starting point for that graphic. This is designed to make simpler what is quite frankly, not a simple process given everything that I've just described of the federal requirements and the mandate under which the CPUC will be acting. But what this graphic shows is what you saw in narrative in the last 3 slides, which is what is the selection process first for those priority applications, priority again being the end-to-end fiber applications. What I'll show you in a few minutes is what happens when there is not a priority or end-to-end solution as we move on to the second type of technology, right? Other reliable broadband service, and then onto the lowest priority technology, alternative technology. This just deals with the starting point, which is the process with regard to those fiber, end-to-end fiber applications. So if you can see here, again, starting up at the top on the left, as the NTIA graphic did, the applications will be received and then they'll be scored, and all the fiber applications will be then ranked by score. What happens in the process then is that the CPUC will determine which are the highest scoring applications for end-to-end fiber on a statewide basis. And for those that do not overlap with each other, so the highest scoring, you'll recall applicants are able to combine different project area units into combinations, contiguous combinations as they see fit, which means there will be a lot of overlap among many applications. But for the highest scoring fiber applications that do not overlap each other, the CPUC will look to see whether that highest scoring application for that given set of project area units is within its budget. If it is within its budget, that application can be preliminarily assigned. If it is not within the budget, given the availability of time, there may be an option of a negotiation to see if that applicant would be willing to bring that application within the available budget. And if so, then that application can be preliminarily assigned. If, however, it cannot be brought within the available budget, that application is removed from consideration, and the CPUC will move on to the next highest scoring application that is not overlapping for that area and go through the same process. And this is a round of review, budget question, and possibly negotiation, leading either to preliminary assignment or removal from consideration based on every application where it is not overlapping or there is no dependency on another application. And that effort will be undertaken in as many cases as possible. The next step, however, is that, as you will recall, the program enables applicants to combine different project area units into a single application so long as they are contiguous. And many applications will have partial overlap with each other. What this means is that there will be applications that score very high, but lower than another application that had a partial overlap. And those high scoring applications we may find that the higher scoring applicant was preliminarily assigned some number of the project area units that was proposed also by that overlapping application. In other words, there's a dependency of this application on the one that scored higher. What that means is that at this stage, the CPUC will take the highest scoring applications that overlap in the sense that some of their project area may have been preliminarily assigned to another application, and the CPUC will make an offer to that applicant who submitted that application for the project area units that have not been assigned, that are still available, at the dollar figure, at the budget that is available for those project area units. And if the applicant accepts those remaining project area units within that budget, those remaining project area units can then be preliminarily assigned to that application, or there's a negotiation, if time permits, to try to bring it within the budget. If it can't be brought within the budget, it is removed from consideration. And this cycle of considering applications now that are reflective of just part of what the applicant might have wanted, but where some of that geographic area may have been awarded or preliminarily assigned to another higher scoring application, that process of negotiation and offer to that applicant for the non-assigned project area units at the budget that is available for those project area units, that process will continue until exhausted. And you can see the cycle here of considering every fiber application possible to see whether those project area units, whether it's for the full application or just what remains unassigned, whether those project area units have been proposed by the highest scorer within budget, and if so, preliminarily assigning them, if not, possibly negotiating and possibly removing from consideration if the price is simply not affordable given the overall statewide BEAD budget. That effort will be undertaken for as long as is possible. Once that has been done, the CPUC may choose to, assuming the availability of time and if it believes these efforts would be helpful, attempt through negotiations to use the following strategies to develop fiber solutions for more of these project area units. That would include removal of project boundaries or consideration of the 90% proposals, offering the applicants awards for their project areas based on the 90% proposals that were considered as additional alternative options in the applications, and other kinds of creative strategies the CPUC may choose to undertake based on its time available and the desire to try to develop a fiber-based solution for as many project area units as possible. And then following that process, following all of this, once these options have been considered and utilized, then the CPUC will move on to considering the process for reliable broadband service. That is to say, the applications that are not for fiber, but are for other forms of reliable broadband service, moving into what we think of as the second step here for reliable broadband service, such as coaxial cable or licensed fixed wireless. And what you see here is that selection process for that other reliable broadband service. Hybrid fiber coax, DSL, licensed fixed wireless, and hybrid licensed and unlicensed fixed wireless networks. And what the process here looks like for these other reliable broadband service applications is pretty much identical to what I just described to you for fiber. The CPUC will undertake exactly the same effort now for all of the project area units that have not been preliminarily assigned to an affordable fiber application. The CPUC will now consider all the applications for these other reliable broadband service technologies, and will go through the same process, looking at them, scoring them, ranking them, and then starting with those that do not overlap each other and that have full service areas of all of their combined project area units, determining is the highest scoring within budget. If so, preliminarily assign. If not, possibly negotiate if time is available. And if it can't be brought within the budget, removing it from consideration, moving on to the next one, including for overlapping applications, for those that have effectively had their service area reduced by the preliminary assignment of some of their selected project area units to another higher scoring applicant. They get the offer of the non-assigned project area units based on budget. And once that process is exhausted, the potential for the CPUC to do the same with the 90% bids or negotiate other kinds of changes based on revised project boundaries and so on, until assuming the availability of time and assuming that it believes that these will be successful strategies. And once all of this is complete, then moving on to the selection process for alternative technologies as defined by NTIA. And you'll recall alternative technologies were right at the bottom of that upside down pyramid. The lowest priority technologies, unlicensed fixed wireless and low Earth orbit satellite, based on the definition and the prioritization of NTIA of the federal government. And at that point, the CPUC will be able to consider for any remaining broadband serviceable locations that do not have alternative technology already, to consider whether unlicensed fixed wireless or low Earth orbit applications can meet those needs, and then preliminarily assign those proposals for those locations. All right. I want to, again, as always, recommend that you look at the decision and at the initial proposal, volume 2, for the original and governing language on all of these topics, because those documents have the language that was approved by the commission itself, as well as by the federal government, respectively, the decision and IPv2, for determining how this program will be run. Because the program design I just described, as I've said so many times now, is really completely different to anything that we have ever seen in broadband planning previously, given the requirement of getting to 100%, an unprecedented requirement, thus requiring an unprecedented design for how the grant program will be run that can effectuate that requirement, and to do so within the framework of a very, very prescriptive set of federal rules that has been mandated for all of the states. And I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Ali.
Thank you so much, Joanne, for the presentation, and thanks to all of you for attending today's webinar. As a reminder, our webinars are open to everyone. If you can go to the next slide. And registration links can be found. Next slide. Thank you. And registration links can be found on the BEAD events page. Our final webinar of December will take place next Tuesday at the same time, focusing on the evaluation and the scoring process in BEAD. We hope you can join us for that one as well. Starting in January, we'll begin hosting office hours every Thursday from 1 to 2 p.m. These sessions will provide a dedicated space and time to answer any questions you may have about the BEAD program. If you have additional questions, in the meantime, feel free to email us at beadgrant@cpuc.ca.gov. Thanks again for joining, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.